Hey everyone, my name is Madeline White, and in this video we will be examining the 16th chapter of Matthew with a specific concentration on verse number 18. So let's do a quick overview of where we are in this book for further context. So in this chapter, we're looking at a revelation that Peter had received. Many actually argue that Peter was the greatest of the 12 disciples, which I would venture to say that he probably was one of the favorites of the Lord's. And in this chapter, Peter shares a revelation that he may have actually had for quite some time. So Matthew 16, verse 15 through 20, tells the story of Jesus asking his disciples who they believe him to be. Peter then comes up with the right answer, it seems, and responds by saying, well, you're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. Jesus then turns around and he tells Peter that he's blessed because of this understanding and that he's going to build his church upon this rock. Jesus furthermore explains that he will give the disciples the keys to heaven and that they may now bind and loose in heaven whatever they bind and loose on earth. Okay, so the key to this passage is what we find in verse number 18. Jesus says, and on this rock I will build my church. What does that mean? There are two common beliefs for the answer to that question. While many believe the rock that Jesus is talking about is Peter the disciple, I argue, and this video will argue, that Jesus is rather indirectly pointing to the messianic revelation that Peter received as the foundational rock of the church. Okay, first we're going to go over why people think Peter is the rock. So now that we have a bit of context behind Matthew 16, let's talk about why people think Peter is the rock. First, in Matthew chapter 16, all 12 of the disciples were present. Yet Jesus promised to give Peter alone the keys of the kingdom. These keys that Jesus was giving Peter symbolize the authority of Christ over the kingdom of heaven on earth, which kingdom of heaven on earth, it's the church. So they symbolize the authority of Christ over the church. Second, Jesus uses the second person, personal, 7 times in just 3 verses. This indicates that clearly Jesus was communicating a unique authority to Peter. Another reason people think Peter is the rock that Jesus was referring to is because Jesus is portrayed as the builder throughout the Bible. He's portrayed as a builder several times. He's never referred to as the building, but rather the builder. Yet he said, I will build my church. Jesus possibly could have been using a play on words, like he enjoyed doing, referring to like the wise man who built his house upon the rock in Matthew 7:24. It's understandable to say that it doesn't fit context to have Jesus building the church upon himself, like I will build my church upon me. So that's understandable. Why people would think that wasn't correct. This could be a reason for the belief that he's building it upon Peter instead. This simply does not really work, though, and here's why. So Matthew has made it clear in Matthew 10:2 that Peter comes first among the 12. This distinction was surely known to Peter, and it made him feel that he was most important among the disciples. However, in verse 23 of this chapter, Jesus refers to Peter as Satan. So here's what's going on. The Lord was telling the disciples of what was to come as far as the crucifixion. And Peter pulls him aside and begins to reprimand the Lord. And he essentially says, heaven forbid, Lord, this will never happen. You will never die on the cross. No, like it's not so. And he's kind of reprimanding the Lord. And Jesus turns to Peter and actually says, get behind me, Satan. Thou art an offense to me, for thou savorest not the things of God, but the things of men. So I don't I don't know about you all, but I have a hard time believing that Jesus would make someone the foundational rock of his church, the foundational rock of the church in one verse, and then a few verses later, call the foundational rock of his church Satan. Yet in chapter 16, Jesus turns around to explain that this significance pales in comparison to the revelation of Jesus Christ. He does this by replying to Peter and declaring in verse 19, he says, "And I, in my turn, have a declaration for you. You are Peter." Then Jesus says this. When Jesus says this, he specifically refers to Peter as Petros. So, you are Petros, which is a small movable rock. So Peter has identified who Jesus is, which is the Son of God. And Jesus, in turn, identifies who Peter is. And at this moment, Jesus was pointing to something bigger. He was saying that Peter had a small part in the big picture, not referencing him as the foundational rock of his church. So, Jesus makes a proclamation to Peter that he will build his church upon the rock, or Petros, the Greek word used, Petros, not Petros. So he calls Peter Petros, and then he says, "I will build my church upon the rock Petros," which is, so they're different. So Petros is translated from Greek as massive rock. Okay, so what is it that Jesus was proclaiming to be Petros, or the massive rock, that the church would be built upon if it wasn't Peter? The context of these surrounding verses provides the answer to this question. So everything's about context. So in verse 15, Jesus asks the disciples who they said that he was. In the following verse, Peter answers that he is Christ, the Son of the living God. These two verses lay the foundation for the purpose of Matthew 16:18. So the focus here should not be upon Peter, but rather the question at hand. So the focus isn't about who Peter is. The focus is, who is Jesus? That's what they're trying to answer. That's what they're trying to figure out in this passage. So understanding that is the main focus of the scripture. The application of the Greek translation of rock can be applied to bring a little light to the truth. The revelation of Jesus as the Christ is the massive rock, or Petros, to which Jesus was referring he would build his church upon. The foundation of the church was not Peter, but rather the revelation that Peter admitted on behalf of the disciples. The truth Peter confessed is the solid rock on which Jesus built his church. Okay, so it is true that Petros and Petros can simply mean stone and rock. However, this claim is without warrant due to the fact that much of the Bible is written in a poetic manner. The distinction in Greek was mostly limited to poetry. So Matthew, having a previous knowledge of this, would have felt more than welcome to use poetic terminology in his writing. The scripture is pointing to the messianic revelation as the foundation upon which the church will be built. Yet some are of the opinion that this statement is directed and aimed at labeling Peter as the rock upon which the church was built. Some allude, such as Beale and Carson, that the rock upon which the church will be built is an allusion to the famous cornerstone prophecy of Isaiah 28:16. This proclaims that he who believes in the cornerstone will not be disturbed, directly pointing to Jesus. Douglas R.A. Hare also reinforces this statement, stating that the differences between Petros and Petros are too vitally important to be misinterpreted due to the meanings behind the words. In the Journal of John P. Mayer, Peter and the Rock, he states that the verse should be read as truly as you are called Peter, on this rock of your profession of your faith shall I build my church. Realizing these differences is vital to understanding the truth behind this statement that Jesus was making in Matthew 16. When we understand the difference and the context between Petros and Petros, the words used, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this correctly, but the words used by Jesus, he wasn't saying, upon this firm rock, Peter, will I build my church. He was saying, he said, you call me the Son of God. You are Petros. Peter, you are Petros. You're a small rock. And upon this rock, this Petros, this large rock, will I build my church. So Jesus came, Jesus died, and Jesus resurrected. The entirety of the Gospels point to his ministry, his sacrifice, and his glorification. Jesus' declaration to Peter concerning the foundation of the church, therefore, should only be viewed in the light of Christ, not in the light of Peter. Many would argue that Peter is the rock upon which the church is built. However, by viewing the scripture through the lens of Christ and viewing the context of that passage, one can easily see the true purpose of Jesus' proclamation. The Greek translations point to Peter as a small stone, but more importantly, point to the revelation that Peter had concerning Jesus as the Petros, or the massive rock upon which the church will be built. The foundation of the church would not be Peter, but instead would be the revelation that Peter had. This revelation is the understanding of Jesus as Christ, the Son of the living God. So, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you enjoyed.